Yeah, hold on. There we are. We are live. I'm going to share this. Wonderful. Okay. Welcome, welcome. We are just getting started. Our go live this evening's discussion with DA Dinah Becton and Patti Giggins, having a conversation about Prop 20. We want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We're just getting started, so we want to give a moment for folks to pop in. We know this has been a long day. We're looking forward to a robust conversation with these two phenomenal leaders. And as folks are joining us on Facebook, my name is Tinisch Hollins. I am the Associate Director of Californians for Safety and Justice and State Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Very excited about this discussion. What a critical time we're in the world and in the state of California. And it's really an honor to be joined by these two really formidable voices in the safety and justice space. One representing decades of work around crime survivors and the support that they desperately need, and one who has been a maven in the criminal justice arena. So have a very open and transparent conversation about the impact of Proposition 20 on survivors and public safety. And it's really important to have this discussion at this time. So we're so honored to be together. Now we have a couple of folks joining us. Welcome, welcome. I wish I could see Facebook, but I'm multitasking here. So while we are here today. So those of you who are joining us out in the virtual space, thank you. As I mentioned, I am with Californians for Safety and Justice and Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Our organization was formed about 8 years ago. 8 years ago. Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice is a national network of crime survivors, more than 40,000 across the country, who are coming together to prioritize healing, prevention, rehabilitation over incarceration spending. Our voices are really important because they're often not heard and not accounted for when we're talking about criminal justice policy or public safety. And this is particularly true of survivors from underserved communities that are really impacted by crime and violence. In California, we have over 12,000 members in 8 different chapter regions. And we are really excited to have this discussion about a proposition on our ballot that has potential to have a direct impact on crime survivors and on public safety at large. There's a lot of public discussion and debate about Prop 20. And so tonight's discussion is very important. This initiative has the potential to roll back key parts of criminal justice reform. And it's really important that survivors' concerns regarding this ballot initiative are considered and discussed. And we want to take some time to dispel the myths that might be connected to Prop 20 and previous reforms. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our phenomenal guests, Patti Giggins, Executive Director of Peace Over Violence, and District Attorney Dinah Becton from Contra Costa County. DA Becton, would you like to say a couple words just in introduction?
Yes, good evening, and thank you so much for organizing this forum so that we can have this really critical conversation about Proposition 20. I'm District Attorney Dinah Becton, District Attorney in Contra Costa County, appointed in 2017 and duly elected by the people in 2018, who voted me into this office because people wanted to make sure that we are basing our policies on issues that land us squarely on issues of fairness and on equity. And so I'm very excited to be with you this evening and to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, DA. And Patti, so glad to be joining you on Facebook Live. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about your history in this work in Peace Over Violence.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me for this. It is an important conversation. We are in an important election time. And it's important that people understand the issues as much as possible. So I've been with Peace Over Violence for about 35 years now, and I started as a volunteer. And Peace Over Violence we're 49 years old. We have been one of the first organizations serving domestic and sexual assault survivors in the country. We'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. And, over the years, we've really developed a very survivor-centric approach. That was part of the initial, um, the mavens who started the organization. That was an initial thrust. And over the years, we've taken policy very seriously. So we have a social service, social change, social justice model. And our mission is to build healthy relationships, families, and communities free from sexual, domestic, and all forms of interpersonal violence.
Oh, there we go. Thank you so much, Patti. Wow, 49 years of history in this work. That's incredible. And considering so much has changed, and unfortunately, so many things have not changed when it comes to the support that crime survivors desperately need in the state of California. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Proposition 20. And before we do, I'm catching a little feedback. DA Becton, would you mind maybe muting? Let's see if the two of you mute while there we go. Maybe that might help a little bit. Thank you. All right. So just a little bit of an overview of Proposition 20. And I want to start by explaining that in the past decade, California voters and lawmakers enacted more than a dozen law changes that prioritized local public safety programs over long prison sentences. Those changes have helped the state comply with the federal lawsuit on prison conditions and reduced the crowded prison population, and crime rates have remained historically low as these reforms have been enacted. These reforms have also reallocated resources towards rehabilitation that prepare folks who are in jail and prison to return to our communities. The funds that we save from criminal justice reform has also reallocated millions of dollars to trauma recovery services to help crime survivors heal. So we've made significant gains in our safety agenda, and unfortunately, Proposition 20 puts those changes at risk by the opponents of criminal justice reform in California that want to go to the failed policies that we've had in the past. What would Proposition 20 do? Proposition 20 would repeal key aspects of public safety realignment initiatives, namely Proposition 47 and Prop 57. The initiative would do three main things. It would prohibit people in prison from rehabilitating themselves before release. It would recategorize certain felonies and violent felonies to incarcerate people for lower level offenses. And it would reduce California's threshold for felony theft to one of the lowest in the nation. Ultimately, it means more people would be going to jail and prison. When considering the impact of Proposition 20, it's important for us to go back and think about what reforms like Prop 47 and 57, what kind of impact they've had on our state and local communities. So I'd like to open up with a question first to you, DA Becton. What do you see as the impact reforms like Prop 47 and 57 have had on our state and local communities, and have they helped make us safer? You'll have to unmute. I'm sorry. There we go.
Yeah, I'll start out by saying that in recent years, California has had we've taken some really, really important steps away from mass incarceration. And mass incarceration brought with it a lot of baggage, an exorbitant cost, racial disparities, and devastation on so many of our communities with very, very little effect on public safety. And so here we are now faced with Proposition 20, which is really an attempt to roll back all of the reforms that we have made in recent years. And this is really not the time to try to turn back the clock. As you noted, Proposition 20 has resulted will result in increasing or decreasing the opportunities to continue the rehabilitative efforts that we've already made. I think if I could, I'd like to also mention some of the things that we have done in terms of reform. We had Prop 47, which was passed by the voters by almost 60% of the vote. And voters really at that time reclassified nonviolent crimes to misdemeanors, certain ones. And then also Prop 67, which was passed by almost 65% of the voters, expanding parole possibilities for good behavior. And so the result of that, though, irrespective of what the narrative might be, is that crime rates are at their lowest levels in recorded history. And that is based on information that we have received from studies that have taken place. Also, our incarceration rates are down. And so not only is our crime going down, our incarcerations are going down, and our state populations are below 100,000 for the first time in decades. And those decades happen to represent those years when we've had those tough policies, tough on crime, war on drugs, etc., that got us to this place of mass incarceration where we have become, unfortunately, the most over-incarcerated country in the world. And so I think according to the PPIC, Prop 47 has significantly reduced racial disparities as well in our arrest and in our bookings, and also the reform efforts that the savings that we have from all of these reform efforts have actually allowed us to put more money into reform. And that reform has allowed us to bring healthy people home from our prisons. One of the things that we don't talk about is the fact that when we lock people up, they're coming home, and they're coming home to our communities. And I think it is extremely important for us to think about whether we want people to come home healthy and whole and be able to participate in our society, such that we would continue to put money into measures that we know work, such as rehabilitation efforts. This is really a conversation about, how are we going to go forward? There is a lot, I think, in our atmosphere right now that tries to make us afraid of all of the progress that we've made. So we really have to ask ourselves, are we going to go forward with a system that really builds itself on equitable principles, on fair principles, or are we going to be stymied and go back and turn the clocks back because we are afraid? Proposition 20 is really trying to get us to be afraid and to retreat from all of the progress that we have made without showing any clear evidence that it hasn't been working.
Patti, you'll unmute. Unfortunately, you're muted.
Thank you for that, DA
There you go.
Becton. I have a question that persists with some of my colleagues in the anti-violence movement and also from survivors themselves, because I've done my research, on Prop 20, but there is information out there or misinformation out there that gives the impression that crimes like sexual assault and rape and domestic violence and sex trafficking and child abuse, that these crimes now are no longer considered violent, so that Prop 20 is going to make them be considered violent crimes. Could you explain that a little bit more for all of us?
Let me unmute. Absolutely, and thank you, because it really is an excellent place to take this conversation. The crimes that you have just mentioned and the crimes that the proponents of Proposition 20 are talking about, they're all very serious crimes. But we also have to recognize that they carry already very significant prison sentences. In some cases, those counts are stacked such that they do lead to life in prison, not even discretionary by a judge. And by the way, having sat as a judge for over 22 years in this county, I know firsthand that the way that those crimes can be charged can result in very, very lengthy sentences. Excuse me. But these past criminal justice reforms that I've just spoken about do not change how those crimes are classified in the penal code, and they do not reduce in any way the significant prison sentence that they carry. So no one's disputing these are heinous crimes. There has to be serious punishment, but it's not what Proposition 20 is about.
It's really interesting to note, and I'm glad that we that you asked that question, Patty. I think it's really critical because, before right before we transitioned into this question, DA Becton mentioned about fear, right, and how much fear is being stoked in this campaign, and the messages, right, the rhetoric that's really being pushed. And as folks who are survivors, identify as survivors, and those of us who advocate and work with directly survivors and advocate on their behalf, the last thing we want to do is create an environment where more harm is possible. And what survivors want more than anything else is to not be harmed again. And so when we have a campaign that is leveraging so much fear, playing in really the re-victimization and traumatization of so many survivors by playing up that fear, it's important to really know what is the truth behind this. And so what we heard from DA Becton is that these crimes are still very serious and still punishable by law, and that there's no protection that's being offered. No additional protection is being offered by Prop 20. Is that correct, DA Becton?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to get parole for any of those crimes that we're talking about. And these propositions that were passed to kind of be a little bit smarter on prison reform. They're not. It's not an easy thing. All of these have stayed the same as far as I know, my research, and so I really challenge everyone to really be mindful of what they believe in television ads, and what it says, because we cannot go back.
Mhm.
We don't want to go back to mass incarceration. We have to keep moving forward. At the same time, obviously being real serious and serious about reimagining public safety.
Mhm. I totally agree, and I think that's what Proposition 20 tries to do. Is it tries to take us backward, some 10, 20 years, when our prisons were just packed with people, especially those who have committed non-violent offenses, and so we've got to keep going forward, make with the progress that we've already made. This has been a huge step in keeping our community safe. And I would really hate to see us go back to the draconian policies that we had some years back.
Right, and I remember the decades where we were turning misdemeanors into felonies. I mean,
Yes.
it was
Mhm.
it was a campaign, a very,
Mhm.
unfortunately, very successful campaign. So we kept creating more crimes and more crimes, as particularly targeting youth and young people,
Mhm.
and
Absolutely.
particularly targeting communities of color. So another question I have, and this has to do about the misdemeanor felony aspect, is about Prop 20 wants to lower the felony theft threshold from $900 down to $450, which I believe used to be at that, but then I think 47 and 57 made it a little higher to 900. And so and it seems that there's a lot of money, a lot of funding behind Prop 20 has to do with businesses who are very concerned about theft, right? So could you illuminate that piece of it for us a little bit more?
Sure. Well, right now, with the changes brought about through our reform efforts, the threshold for a felony theft charge is at $950. And it's really important to note that the threshold that we have in California at that amount is still among the lowest in the country. even after it was raised in 2014 by Proposition 47. For example, in Texas, the felony theft threshold is at $2,500. It's at $1,500 in Alabama and $1,000 in Missouri. And so in California, trying to reduce that standard to $250 for certain offenders, that would simply be draconian. Many states in recent years have been increasing their felony theft thresholds, and a Pew Research study found that doing so had no impact whatsoever on crime rates. And so, again, that's why it's so important that we say these things out loud, because otherwise the fear mongering will drive the conversation. Charging people with felonies, forcing them to endure long collateral sentences, and then having a felony conviction on their records does not address the root causes of crime. In fact, it only exacerbates the conditions that lead to crime in the first place. And I want to pause here because it is so important to think about what happens when people are convicted of a felony. People have that felony on their records. The felony conviction can help to lead to disenfranchisement, but also keep people from reintegrating into our society, keeps people from getting jobs, keeps people from being able to get certain student loans and even housing. And so all of these things would prevent a person from being a healthy, participating member in our society. There's a felony theft statute on the books right now in California, meaning that anyone involved in any sort of organized retail theft, and that's one of the things that you'll also hear the proponents of Proposition 20 talk about, that there's organized retail crime. But we already have statutes on the book that address that. So what we need to do is really to prioritize investments in the things that we know meet the needs of our communities. And that is putting money into rehabilitation, making sure that our victims are taken care of, and making sure that our whole community can move forward in a way that helps us all to be healthy and to thrive, and not to build these new policies based on fear.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, that even this idea of felonizing, I don't know if that's a word, to felonize, felonizing everything, every crime, every misdeed, really impacts families.
It does.
It's not that people think, that person did that bad thing, they're the bad guy, they should go to jail or prison. But it's also the families, it's whole communities. That's why it's so important to take it really seriously and not feel like, not make laws that are so draconian, I think the term that you used.
That's absolutely right. I mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again. Most of the people who are in prison, they're coming back. They're coming back to our communities at some point. And we really do want to give them a chance, not only for themselves, but also for their families and for our entire community. We want to give them a chance to come back healthy and to come back ready to productively integrate back into our society as fathers, as brothers, as sisters. All of these things are so important. So when we try to reinforce these draconian policies, we're really impacting again and traumatizing an entire community.
Yeah, Dia Becton, you made me think about something that's another thought or another piece of information that's been floating around about Proposition 20, and that's about parole, right? And so there's a big question out there about, how Proposition 20 could impact parole and whether or not it would keep folks who were violent or folks who committed crimes in prison for the crimes that they committed, if they were participating in rehabilitative programming and having the opportunity to go before the parole board or go to a parole hearing. What can you say about denials or approvals? What can you say about the potential for folks being released back into our communities who are serving sentences for crimes, how this proposition could impact that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the proposition would seek to deny the opportunity for early parole based on good behavior and other factors to a large percentage of people who are incarcerated. And really, again, this is also another narrative that's based on fear. Let's just state the facts. 80% of the Proposition 57 parole hearings ended in denials as of 2019. So that this idea that somehow violent and dangerous criminals are being released onto our streets because of criminal justice reform is just plain inaccurate, because that is not occurring. And what Proposition 20 is seeking to do is to roll back the clock on those legitimate reforms.
Wow, 87% denial rate as of 2019.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, that's significant.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm thinking about opportunities, right, and investment, I know that a big part of reform, for folks who are on the outside, they may have a different view of incentivizing, right, participation in programs. But to your point and to Patty's point, the majority of folks who are incarcerated are going to return home, and we want them to return home healthy. We want them to return home, but we also have to be aware that they're returning home with very serious lifelong barriers and restrictions because of their contact with the criminal justice system. But we're thinking about investments and opportunities. I'm wondering about rehabilitation, and how important is that to public safety? How important is that we prioritize it? Historically, we haven't prioritized rehabilitation. And I think that we've underestimated how important that is, not just for public safety, but for healing. So in your, and I'll pose this question to both of you. Why is ensuring that folks who are in prison have opportunities to participate in rehabilitative programming especially important for survivors and folks who've been harmed in the community?
Patty, do you want to go first?
I think what's really important we know so much more about trauma now. And we also know that hurt people. So that we understand now that there are all these antecedents that are impacting someone who does wind up, either being on the other side of the law or committing some different crimes, or even hurting sometimes their own family, right? And that there are a lot of issues there that we are not focusing on. We're focusing on put these people away, but their families want them to come home. Their communities want them to come home. And sometimes even the violence that happens in terms of some of the violent crimes, it is among people who know each other. It is within, known groups of people and within families. And even with that, we work a lot obviously within the domestic violence arena. And so many of the survivors want the violence to stop. They don't necessarily want their loved one to go to jail for a really long time, number one. They want them to get help. And so this is another example of survivors not necessarily being asked what they want, what kind of consequences could be meaningful for them, and so that's a big gap, I think, that we have. And really understanding trauma, understanding ACEs, about all the childhood adverse situations that can happen, that can impact a young person growing up. That it's in some ways, if we ignore how there's almost a programming for certain people to wind up to be, when we talk about it, the prison pipeline. We know so much more now. And for us to continue these same policies, it's shame on us. They haven't worked. Survivors want their loved ones home. They want them well. They want them reintroduced to the family and the community. And I think that's an important population that needs to be considered when we make these laws, and when we remake these laws, which we're trying to do.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, again, we're going back to this scare tactics, because if we try to go back to the policies that we had in the past, it's going to force cuts in rehab, in schools, and in mental health, and in homelessness. Proposition 47 has saved nearly $400 million already from reducing the people who are incarcerated in our prisons. And it is expected that it will save another $100 million every year in perpetuity going forward. And what's so important about those savings is that the savings are reallocated back into our communities to deal with the same issues that Patti was just speaking about. It is reallocated back in our communities to deal with trauma and recovery services. That's what we need for our victims, to help our victims heal. It is also reallocated into truancy prevention programs, which I know in Contra Costa County has been a tremendous help in our communities. And then there are other programs that meet the needs of our communities that are really focused on keeping crime from occurring in the first place, and then also rehabilitation efforts that focus on keeping crime from reoccurring. By way of example, right here in Contra Costa County, our county's health department received nearly $12 million for a pre-arrest and pre-booking diversion program that helps keep people out of the system and gets them into programs so that they can get help. So I think those savings have been a tremendous help also to victims of crime, to help with the trauma recovery, but also a tremendous help to place the emphasis and the money on rehabilitation, so that when people do come home from prison, they come home healthier and whole and were able to participate in a positive way in our society. All of those things together help keep our community safer.
Yes, the investing in serving and helping victim survivors heal is so important. And we now have a trauma recovery center movement. We have 15 in the state of California. We have 8 in Southern California. We are one, actually. Peace Over Violence is in a unique collaboration with the Downtown Women's Center in Los Angeles. And we serve clients of all different kinds of crime, but predominantly domestic violence, sexual violence, and also in terms of the homeless connection, where many of the women on the streets actually have been victimized through domestic violence. And so there are 34 now, I think, across the country. And we formed an alliance of trauma recovery centers because we also want to have impact on how people think about trauma recovery, and think about it from both ends, serving survivors, but also how can we rehabilitate offenders again. And some of the things that we do at the Trauma Recovery Center is case management. We also, there's therapies, counseling, access to the funding from victim of crime compensation, so that if people need to move, they can get money to move to another location and a different home. Many people who, if they're victimized in their home, they don't want to stay in their home. It's too traumatizing. And what we've been able to do is really help victim survivors apply for this funding that can help their families and help them make them whole again. And we are finding that now that with some of our influence, some of the rules and regulations, which with government funding can be very onerous. We're starting to see that there's some of that's changing and making these funds more easily accessible to victims. So I think this idea of not pumping all the money into prisons and jails and over policing communities, but think about, hey, how about over healing? Let's saturate the healing model, because if we think about well-being, we want to think about physical well-being, emotional well-being, spiritual well-being, and also safety, within the family and within the community. And that takes a lot of investment because we're still being reactionary for so many decades of being so just punishment oriented and almost forgetting about the victims and saying, well, what the victims want is punishment. You know, the victims want healing. And I believe most victims want healing for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I concur with that. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, DA.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that Patty, I think you really hit it right on the head. But I also wanted to mention one other thing that we often fail to talk about. We talked about the savings from Proposition 47 and how that has been used to help victims and to rehabilitate people who are returning to our communities. But we also have to mention that the Legislative Analyst's Office has confirmed that Proposition 20 is going to cost tens of millions of dollars every year. And that's money that is being taken away from taxpayers. Prop 20 will take away money from victim programs that help victims recover and participate with law enforcement. Prop 20 forces critical cuts to other priorities. We've already talked about the rehabilitation, but there are other priorities that are important to the wholeness and well-being of our communities, like programs for homelessness and crime prevention, and programs in our schools so that we can continue to break that pipeline that leads our kids from school to prisons. So not only are we talking about affecting the savings that we've received from Prop 47, but we're also, on the other hand, talking about also spending tens of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money on keeping people in prison longer.
That's critical to note for a lot of reasons. You know, one is that what it says to me is that we have an over-reliance on incarcerating our problems away, right? We have, I think if there's anything that the pandemic has exposed, you know, for all of our systems is that we were ill prepared to deal with big crises, right? Public health crisis, education, you name it. All of our systems have been challenged by COVID and all the other you know, huge issues that we've been facing in California and throughout the country. And it really forced us to stop and think about where have our investments been going, right? How is it that we have a global pandemic and people literally losing their lives, but we don't have enough ICU beds? We don't have enough ventilators, right? And I think these are all things that the majority of the public took for granted that we had, right? That we had this infrastructure. But then when we start looking at where the investments have been going, whether it's public health, public education, public safety, billions and billions of dollars have been poured into systems that just have not worked and been responsive. It makes me think two things. One is I heard you both talk a lot about addressing the root cause, right? How do we get to the root? That's what trauma recovery centers do, right? At the core is how do we show up for people? How do we address the hurt that they're carrying? And what we've learned from the criminal justice system failures and also through realignment is that punishment alone does not bring justice or bring closure for survivors, right? And so we've got to do more, we've got to do better, and we've got to be clear about how we get there. It also, you know, just kind of brings to mind another piece of the narrative related to Prop 20, and that's around the retail theft, right? I heard you talk a little bit about that, DA Becton, and you know the big story that's out there is that, you know, if we can cast a wider net, right, and catch folks who are caught or are committing low-level crime, then maybe the likelihood that we will be able to convict folks for other crimes that they may be connected to. Because if a person commits one crime, they have to, by nature, be a bad person, a violent person, a serial criminal, right? But we all know through relationship and also through reality that that's just not true, right? Look at the situation that we have that we're facing with in California right now, with so many folks being out of work. But not only that, our mental health infrastructure, our substance abuse, the challenge that we have with substance abuse treatment here in California, and homelessness, that nexus, right? are huge issues that the state was facing long before Proposition 20 was proposed as a solution. So I'm just curious, and Patti, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, because I know that you've heard this in your space. I know that it comes up in our space because survivors want to know, and the things that we see as being real issues, right, that need to be addressed. It's been fascinating to learn that there are big retailers and grocers that are supporting Proposition 20, and that crime victims are actually being put at the front of this discussion and saying, yes, folks who are stealing in stores, grocery stores, definitely make me feel unsafe. And this proposition could help. What do you think about that?
Well, one of the things I think about it, I know that these grocery chains all have insurance for theft. Number one, let's not forget that. But yes, it's unfortunate that theft is not a cool thing, and it can. And when I sometimes think of smaller stores where there's theft, it can be serious. It has its impact, but you know what? That's not what's going to make us safer. That's not going to make us safer. Why are we asked the question, why are people doing this? I mean, if it's organized crime, or as you mentioned, DA Beckham, we've got laws on the books for that, right? But I think what's so important is that we are not focusing on prevention. The investment in prevention education, in dealing with poverty, investing in wealth creation. We have this idea that consequences and accountability have to equal very harsh punishment. I don't think anyone's saying that there shouldn't be accountability or consequences for things that people do that are harmful. But we've gotten to such a place that we are actually damaging our own society, and we can't go back to that. We can't go back to the 25 years of mass incarceration and creating felonies and criminalizing youth, particularly youth of color, and the whole broken windows methodology of policing. That's pretty much been debunked now, because that was profiling communities, profiling neighborhoods, and going in. And that's the way we're going to do prevention, because they don't take care of their trash. So that's where crime is going to happen. We have to have a whole different mindset and attitude. And, many of the police chiefs that I've spoken with, they're the ones who also say we cannot jail our way out of these social issues, and it's a remedy that I think we've proved to ourselves, and COVID-19 has exposed our weaknesses and our failures of where we invest our goodwill, where we invest our intelligence, where we invest our money, and I hope when we come out of COVID-19, we're going to have a lot more different ideas about how to create a society that really cares about all its people.
You're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, I agree with you, Patti, and I feel like we don't really have a choice, right? Like it's really on us in this moment. It's clear that there's huge shifts happening in society, huge shifts happening in our community, huge opportunities. And I know that we're almost at time, so I have like one final question that should kind of guide us to a closing thought, and that we talked a lot about reforms, right? We talked a lot about the need to address the root causes and the trauma. We talked about the need to increase our investments in prevention and interventions that don't do more harm. What do you all think we could do to build off of these reforms that we have passed, rather than repeal and go backwards? What are some of the most important provisions to kind of lift up right now while we have this opportunity to create?
I think in terms of continuing the reforms, one of the things that we have to do is we have to do a really good job of getting out the good news, because according to the Public Policy Institute, Prop 47, crime did not go up. And we really have to drive that point. We have to get out and the information that combats this narrative that's based on fear. And we also want to make sure that we get out the information that the studies show that crime has really decreased in California. And so that we don't allow this narrative of fear to drive the conversation. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that trying to go back to these policies where we're putting drug addicts and shoplifters in jail, that is not something that is going to be helping us out of these problems. You've already mentioned that we have tried in the past to basically punish our way out of these social problems, but that's not going to help. I've already stopped in my office prosecuting low-level drug offenders unless and until they reach their third offense in a 12-month period. And instead, we're referring those cases to the healthcare system so that people can get the help that they need and stop these chronic patterns of arrest that exist. And then finally, I think the other thing that's going to be so important for us is to make sure that we begin to think about using data to drive our decision making. I'm really pleased that my office is partnering with the Vera Institute so that, because in the past, prosecutors have not really taken a deep dive into the disparate impact that we might be having on our communities. And so what the Vera Institute will be helping us do is to look at our data, see how we are affecting our communities, and to make sure that if we find that there's disparate treatment, that we are now shifting our thinking and our policies toward different practices that not only keep our communities safe, but that we do so in a way that's fair and equitable for everyone. So I think it's so key to remember that we just can't go back to this whole idea that locking people up, that is the answer to community safety. I think we have to go forward, not with fear, but also go forward thinking about what is equitable and what is fair in our community, and while we're keeping our communities safe.
So important. Thank you, D.A. Becton. Patti, how about you? How do you think we build from here?
Yeah, we have to keep going. I agree with everything that both of you have been saying, and where it's going to be a heavy lift because when you make some progress, there's always a backlash, right? And that's what we're experiencing. Prop 20 is a backlash proposition, to my mind. But we are making inroads, and we have to take that money and invest it not only in trauma recovery centers, but in education, in the truancy programs, in alternatives to incarceration, focusing on people who have substance abuse issues, mental health, incarceration of people who have mental health issues. And that means we have to have a much, much better health system response, a public health system, and not put everything into law enforcement and incarceration and prisons and jails. It's not working, and we have to reverse it. And it's time to be bold and have some experimentation. Let's take some other risks to see, as you talk about data. Let's take some risks, get some data, and see how we can improve. But the severe punishment model, it's actually a spiritually deadening thing for us even to want to have it, as far as I'm concerned. And we have to think of well-being for everybody.
I so agree with that. It's about our connectedness at the end of the day. Harm is real. The need for folks to be accountable for the harm that they cause is real. But we can't ignore that those connections are not severed. That what happens in each of these situations to each of these individuals has a ripple effect on society and all of our communities in one way or another. And we need to start thinking that way if we're really going to prevent more harm from happening. And we're actually going to restore, right? Because I think that's anyone who's been harmed, including myself, my family, there's restoration. You wake up every day hoping that you can reclaim a part of yourself, a part of your dignity, a part of your safety, right? And that's important. But this system that we currently have doesn't offer that. It can't. And I think that we have to be honest about it and accept it. You know, that some things cannot be fixed, but we do have an opportunity to be creative, like you said, Patti, to really start thinking about what could different responses look like, and how do we honor the relationships that we still may have, even with those who have done harm, so that we can pull out of it. And then to your point, DA Beckham, making sure that we have the right resources and support, that we're guiding people to the right places, right? If they have an issue, so that we can really get what we need, and that's whole human beings and less harm. So I'm just so honored to have been in this conversation with both of you. I know that this is the first of many conversations that will continue to happen long after Proposition 20 hopefully is defeated. It's important that we continue having these discussions regardless of the outcome, because the timing is calling for it. So I just want to thank you for being a part of this, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in to this Facebook Live. I want to encourage everyone to take the opportunity now to be a part of that transformation and exercise your right to vote if you haven't already done so. Take the time to investigate for yourself, have the tough conversations you need, do your own work, your own critical work of understanding what's at stake, and then casting your ballot. We have a campaign right now to heal the vote. And that's important because for decades, policies have been used, they've been weaponized against our communities. Legislation has been weaponized against our communities. And so it's important for us to understand how that happens. It's important for us to see ourselves in the laws and the policies that we fight for and that we advocate for. And so that's what this Heal the Vote campaign is about. It's about educating yourselves. It's about exercising your right. It's about doing so in community with the intent to heal. And so I want to encourage you, if you're watching, please pledge. Please go ahead and dial our pledge number. Join us online at cssj.com/org rather /vote, and get more information in these final days. We are 6 days away, almost 5 days now, as the sun is setting. So we have an opportunity, and we got to stay committed regardless of what the outcome is, to keep working together. So DA Becton, thank you so much for being here with us tonight, for everything, all the information, all your wisdom and history that you shared on this proposition and all this work. Patti, it's an honor to be sharing space with you and learning from you and learning with you about how we shift this culture in our communities and actually get healing. And I look forward to working with y'all more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for hosting this important conversation.
All right. Have a good night. Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Vote.
Vote.